right. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on what time zone you are in. Welcome to the second Interfor Academy event in our regular series featuring our Academy experts. I'm very excited to welcome the over 200 clients, associates, and friends from around the world who registered to join us today. We had a great response to the first event with former FBI Chief Hostage Negotiator Steve Romano, and we think today's event will live up to the high expectations that our first event set. For those of you who don't know, Interfor Academy is a select group of highly accomplished experts, each with direct connections to the worlds of security, intelligence, and security matters. These experts are available for keynote speeches, a wide range of trainings, and other engagements, from boots on the ground tactical sessions all the way to strategic board and exec level engagements. So if you'd like to learn more, please email us or reach out directly to your contact at Interfor to start a conversation. I'll drop the email address into the chat shortly. I'm pleased to introduce Jeremy Hurewitz, the head of Interfor Academy. He's the host of today's event. Jeremy is not just the head of Interfor Academy, he's also a member. He works with our clients on his very, very popular Sell Like a Spy program, which helps to bring spy tradecraft into the business world. I'll be jumping on later on to help facilitate the Q&A, but for now, Jeremy, over to you.
Thanks so much, Don. Welcome, everybody. It's great to be with you all, and I'm really excited for this conversation with Professor Bruce Hoffman. So I want to get right to it, but let me introduce Professor Hoffman here. Bruce Hoffman is one of the leading experts on extremism and global terrorism. With over 5 decades of experience researching, writing, and speaking about these subjects, Bruce is the author of many highly regarded books, including the widely acclaimed Inside Terrorism. And he is a sought-after voice to help audiences understand these challenging subjects. He is a professor at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service, the Shelby Column and Catherine W. Davis Senior Fellow for Counterterrorism and Homeland Security at the Council on Foreign Relations, and the George H. Gilmore Senior Fellow at the U.S. Military Academy's Combating Terrorism Center. Bruce previously held the corporate chair in counterterrorism and counterinsurgency at the RAND Corporation, and he's been a scholar in residence at the for counterterrorism at the CIA. He's also served as an advisor to the U.S. military in Iraq. Bruce's latest book, which we'll share a link to, is called Guns, God, and Sedition: Far-Right Terrorism in America. And you can see how relevant that is to today's discussion. Bruce, so great to have you here today. How are you?
Good. Delighted to be here, Jeremy.
Terrific. Well, let's jump right into things. And I want to start with the idea of the war on terror. Of course, the attacks on America after 9/11 and its allies, the West essentially declared a war on terror. What followed were 2 decades of war, primarily in Iraq and Afghanistan, but of course taking place at other locations around the world. I wanted to invite you to get things started by reflecting for us on whether you think we should still consider ourselves in the war on terror, or should we think about it a little differently? And I thought you might also bring in some, really recent events, the attack in Moscow on ISIS-K, and then this recent counterterrorism attack, if you will, in Syria by potentially the Israelis. So just want to have you break the ice and kind of reflect on these developments for us, if you would.
If there's been one constant over the past 23 years, it's been precipitously declaring victory in the war on terror. And every president since President Bush, President Obama, President Trump, and President Biden have all declared victory in the war on terror. But I always fall back on the observation made by the then Commander-in-Chief of the United States' Central Command, General James Mattis, about a dozen years ago, when he said the enemy always gets a vote. We may think it is over, we may hope it is over, but in the enemy's eyes, they have a say in this. And incontrovertibly, just as you pointed out, with the attacks in Moscow on the Crocus Theater by ISIS-K, the Islamic State's unfortunately still vibrant branch in Afghanistan, I think it patently shows that the war on terror is not over, not least because in recent months, the current commander of U.S. Central Command, General Eric Kurilla, has said that ISIS-K could become threatening to Europe and even the United States in as little as 6 months without warning, and that's going back to the end of last year. The director of the National Counterterrorism Center, Christine Abizade, similarly said some months ago that the terrorist entity she is most concerned about in the world, and that's a quote, is ISIS-K. So clearly, we hope the war on terror ended when we withdrew from Afghanistan in August 2021. But what we see is that our enemies have not laid down their arms. They've not given up the fight. And that, unfortunately, now on multiple levels, and you yourself just pointed out, I mean, we've got the ISIS-K attack in Moscow. Of course, we had the tragic events of October 7th in Israel. And then now the attack presumably by Israel in Damascus against one of the senior commanders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the Quds Force, Iran's sort of stalking horse in the Middle East that coordinates all its proxy activities. And indeed, my recent book, which talks about domestic terrorist threats. I mean, that book focuses on the far right threat, but there's also a threat in the United States from the far left as well. I mean, we've got really a waterfront of terrorist threats, whereas compared to a little bit more than a decade ago, there was only one threat, and that was basically from Al-Qaeda.
Yeah, absolutely. We certainly have our hands full in the world of extremism. And I'm looking forward to getting to the discussion about the challenges we face here in America that you write about so well in your book. But speaking of writing, I want to talk a little bit about a column that you authored along with the president of Interfor International, Don Aviv, who we just heard from, talking about how essentially Palestinian terrorism has changed the world. We're going to share that column with people. I'm sure some of the people who are on with us today have read that, but I thought it warranted a little bit more of a deeper discussion. I wanted to invite you to kind of share some of the key points about that column and maybe reflect a little bit on the current state of warfare and what's going on in Gaza, including the tragic death of these aid workers that we're all upset about today.
It dovetails actually with your previous question and my answer, because I think there's a tendency, almost always, unfortunately, to see terrorism as an episodic or a spasmodic threat, as well as a continuing one that's part of a trajectory. And certainly, as Don and I wrote in that essay, there's a long trajectory of Palestinian terrorism that has changed the world. I mean, look, when we get on aircraft and the security measures, whether it's the metal detectors or whether it's having our carry-on baggage inspected through X-rays, I mean, all that originated long before the September 11th, 2001 attacks, and they originated largely in response to the wave of aircraft hijackings by Palestinian terrorist groups of yesteryear, like the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, for example, that really convulsed the Middle East and Europe between 1968 and the 1970s until these security measures were put in place and diminished them. So what we have to see is that Palestinian terrorism is part of a trajectory that has emerged today as we've gotten better globally in countering terrorism. Once again, the point is terrorists haven't laid down their arms. They haven't forgotten about their struggles. They've merely developed new means to obviate or to overcome even the most consequential countermeasures that we've put in their path. And unfortunately, one has to conclude that terrorism's stubborn resilience is a reflection of the fact that, at least in the minds of the perpetrators, so I'm not saying this is a rule, but I'm saying in the minds of the perpetrators, terrorism works. It achieves the terrorist organization's goals. So then as now it was to isolate Israel, and the advent of Palestinian terrorism from the late 1960s, early mid-1970s resulted in the fact that by 1980, the Palestine Liberation Organization had not only been recognized as or given observer status in the United Nations, but that the PLO had diplomatic relations with more countries than Israel, the established nation state, had. And that fueled, we saw the effects in the 1970s that many other aggrieved ethno-nationalist religious groups, separatist groups throughout the world were inspired and motivated by the Palestinians' example. And one of the key examples that we note in that essay is the 1972 Munich Olympic massacre of 11 Israeli athletes that, rather than generating worldwide opprobrium, resulted in Yasser Arafat, who was then chairman of the PLO, being invited to address the United Nations General Assembly, and then this process of recognition. So with that message that terrorism pays, you can see why it has remained so stubborn and resilient, that there is still aggrieved peoples throughout the world and groups that fundamentally believe that they can catapult their causes into the limelight. They can attract attention to themselves and their causes and not risk much cost, especially in a world where there's a dynamic that anything that the oppressed undertakes, no matter how heinous, no matter how vile that violence is, if it's in the name of resistance, it's somehow justified. And I think, unfortunately, increasingly becoming legitimized. And then the last thing I'll say is that we often forget that terrorism is a strategy of provocation. It's designed to provoke the terrorist enemies to overreact, to engage in acts of counter violence, to engage in responses that play into the terrorist narrative, and to make tragic mistakes such as those which killed the aid workers yesterday in Gaza, but then indeed to launch the kind of military operation that amasses tens of thousands of civilian casualties and begins to actually have a profound effect on global dynamics that turns opinion away from the initial victim, whoever that victim is. And that's one of the problems in the Middle East. Is the Israeli historian Benny Morris, one of his books is titled Righteous Victims, because of course both sides see themselves as victims. But in other words, from the terrorist perspective, you can perpetrate or perpetuate, I should say, this upward spiral of violence that rebounds badly against your opponent.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad you mentioned probably my favorite book on this longstanding conflict. I recommend Benny Morris's Righteous Victims to anybody that I find I can have a reasonable conversation with who wants to learn more about the depth and contours of this longstanding conflict. So if anybody on this webinar is interested in reading a great book about it, please go check out Benny Morris's Righteous Victims, which is full of hard truths for both sides. I think you'd agree, Bruce. I was actually going to talk about your book, but I want to build on what you're talking about here and just talk briefly about social media. If it leads to a discussion about what's going on in the US, that's fine, but I thought we'd come back to that next. But I want to get into it because in the column, you talk about how the legacy of, or the methods rather, of Palestinian terrorism have evolved over time. It's a learning organization, right? They realized if they attract large-scale media attention, it can, reap benefits for them. Well, then they moved into the second Intifada, and there was the suicide bombings. And now, as you note in the column, this PR strategy of maximizing, cynically, civilian deaths and then broadcasting that on social media has led to Israel becoming almost essentially a pariah internationally as it tries to defend itself and eradicate this, existential threat. I'd like to invite you to talk a little bit about how social media has impacted the world of extremism that you've been studying, as we noted, for around 5 decades.
Well, there's absolutely no doubt that social media has really infused extremism with a new venue, a new platform, a new way to spread. And I think it's had enormously corrosive impacts, especially on democratic states. It's undermined trust and confidence in elected leadership in many instances. It's undermined confidence in our democratic processes. It's introduced a whole different set of truths or facts. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when in the 1990s, the internet was seen as an engine of enlightenment and of education that was going to put everyone on an equal playing field with the truth. In point of fact, it's had the opposite effect. We're at a point now where people under 40, for example, according to a recent report by the Reuters Institute at Oxford University, that upwards of 40% of both millennials and Generation Z prefer to get their news from social media platforms like YouTube or Facebook or TikTok and so on, that they prefer to get their news from social influencers and that they want to be entertained, which is completely different from how the news was disseminated in the past. Because as you well know, as having had a career in journalism, that any journalist have to have multiple verifiable sources for the information they're communicating. Often the reporters themselves are fact-checked by whoever is publishing their material, whether it's online or in print or broadcast over the radio or television. And indeed, there's editors that perform a critical additional vetting function. Well, obviously, social influencers and social media platforms have none of those checks, none of those balances. So any information that is seen, unfortunately, in this day and age, at all titillating, at all compelling, regardless of its veracity, spreads faster now than it could ever have spread before. And a mythology develops that may be completely divorced from reality.
Mm-hmm.
So we've always known, going back to Senator Hiram Johnson after World War I, that the first casualty in war is the truth. But it's now becoming a casualty with a pervasiveness and a rapidity because of social media and because of connectivity that in years past would have been completely unimaginable.
Yeah. What's that old saying that a lie gets around the world before the truth can even get his shoes on or something like that?
Well, and that's the point. I mean, these falsehoods we find, the trouble is this is bleeding into mainstream media, and these falsehoods are perpetuated by some highly respected newspapers of record, by wire services and so on. And then days later, they appear not on the front page or not as the lead item, but on page 9 or page 14, or in a very small box on a website. That retraction appears, but by then the damage has already been done.
Yeah, we've certainly seen a lot of that when it comes to Israel with, missile attacks that were misfired from Hamas or Islamic Jihad being called Israeli strikes. And then, this small little noted correction that comes out. And meanwhile, everyone's all worked up about it. Let's stay on social media just for a minute, though, and kind of two aspects I'd just like to hear from you on. What can be done about it? Do you favor regulating social media as a utility of some sort? And then the hot button debate is on TikTok right now. I've written as a former China hand that I'm in favor of banning TikTok. I wonder, where you stand on it. So two-part question there to build on.
Well, actually, my new book, the God, Guns, and Sedition, the largest chapter is on policy recommendations. And we understand, myself and my co-author, Jacob Ware, understand very clearly that, firstly, a lot of the rules that have been put in place by the European Union, by the United Kingdom, do not so neatly apply to the United States because of the First Amendment and our constitutional freedom. So we're very careful in that respect. But I have to say, since the book was published in early January, Jacob and I have been up on the Hill quite a lot, meeting with members of Congress from both sides of the aisle, more from one side than the other. But we have had contact with both sides, and what they both agree on, and which we advocate in our book, is a very simple fix, and that's reforming Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act that was enacted in the mid-1990s in 1996, and basically held internet and social media companies exempt from any liability for the information they publish on their platforms, which is completely different from established media. Established media are held responsible for any content that they publish or broadcast. Now, in the mid-1990s, when the United States wanted to grow Silicon Valley and encourage this expansion, when the vast majority of people in the United States and elsewhere got their news from traditional media sources back in the 1990s, it was in fact the three major television networks in the US, CBS, NBC, and ABC. They all had nightly news shows. That was the main source, or else leading newspapers. I mean, it made sense. But now in an era where more people get their news from Facebook than established newspapers, for example, from exactly these social influencers, as I described, it doesn't make sense anymore. And that's a very simple step that does have bipartisan support and should be enacted and would be an important step forward. And I've forgotten now the second part of the question.
The second one was about TikTok, but I just want to ask you, how would it work though? Would Facebook and the rest of them have to, hire, tens of thousands of curators or to eliminate the content as it pops up? And how do you police content on social media like that?
Well, I think what's obvious from the series of congressional hearings that we've seen in recent years is that we can't rely on social media to police themselves. That's patently obvious. And if anything, in recent years, particularly the X platform, but other platforms have been very open that they've cut back on their content moderation and basically trimmed it much more extensively than in the past. So yes, they would. I mean, or they would have to find. I mean, with the development of artificial intelligence,
right?
There's a danger, certainly, that this may just exacerbate fake news and deep fakes, both in terms of news stories, but videos and so on. But it's also a very powerful tool that could be harnessed to police these platforms much more effectively. And this isn't, at least to my knowledge, as extensive and serious discussion and debate as we should be having.
Yeah. And real quick, before we move on here, are you in favor of banning TikTok?
For years now, the national security establishment in the United States have discussed this vulnerability from TikTok. Leading scholars of terrorism and communication, like Haifa University's Professor Gabriel Weiman, has written extensively how TikTok has become a fountainhead of extremism, of anti-Semitism, and so on. I don't know if it necessarily should be banned, but I think the plans that it needs different ownership, that it shouldn't be as closely tied to China as it is. So I'm not necessarily for a ban, but I think that there have to be significant changes.
For sale sounds good, and if not a ban, that's what I would say. But let's before we get into your book, I want to remind everybody that Bruce and I are gonna speak for about halfway through the hour, and then we'd like to invite anybody who's with us today to offer a question. You can put it in the Q&A button, I believe that's down there, and we will take a look at that. So please do think of questions and put them in there, and we'll hopefully get to that. But in the meantime, Bruce, can you talk a little bit about your book and the kind of sorry state of the U.S. at the moment, and give us some insight into what we're facing with the election, and go ahead and scare us, if you will.
Well, I hate to scare people and be alarmist, but unfortunately, it's the nature of this field. And as I talked about earlier, trajectory. I mean, that's the problem, is we often have a very ahistorical view of terrorism, and as I said, see it as spasmodic or episodic rather than as part of a continuum. And that's really the argument of the book, that of course hate groups and intolerance has existed in the United States, for centuries, certainly decades. The argument we make is that in the 1980s it began to change, and it started not only to continue the hatred and intolerance, but to shift towards a very profound form of anti-government extremism. Mm-hmm. Sedition. I mean, and we have 22 members of the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers who were involved in the events at the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021, who were convicted of seditious conspiracy. Arguably, the most serious crime in the United States is a democracy, and also one of the most difficult to prove, because we're talking about a conspiratorial element. And that's our main argument, is that in the 1980s, these groups began to shift and have a very salient seditious component that has only continued and indeed has gathered momentum in the 21st century, largely because of social media and the connectivity that social media provides, but also because of various developments in our political system. Undermining of the trust in elected leaders, for example, the paralysis that we see in government has led people in their frustrations to embrace conspiracy theories on the one hand, or to lose faith in our democracy and lose faith in our republic, and to advocate, such as we saw on January 6, 2021, extreme measures. So we frame January 6th not as the culmination of this process or as an aberration, but rather of a continuum. And we've already seen election-related threats and violence on both sides of the aisle. I mean, on the cover of our book, for example, is a scaffold and a hangman's noose that was erected outside of the United States Capitol on January 6th, 2021. That wasn't there necessarily for Democrats. It wasn't there for Nancy Pelosi, for example, who's often been the focus of a lot of this anger and opprobrium. It was erected to lynch a serving Republican vice president of the United States, who also happened to be a Christian evangelical adherent. And in that sense, what we see is that a party that's turning on its own. I mean, there's currently someone running for Senate who has a commercial that offers rhino hunting license, rhino not for the animal, but Republicans in name only, and actually says that anyone who disagrees with one particular viewpoint in a party should be fair game. I mean, this is done with a kind of, tongue-in-cheek wink and a nod, but we've seen that words have dire consequences. That and can lead to tragedy. I mean, don't forget, on the morning of January 6, 2021, there were pipe bombs found in front of both the Republican national headquarters as well as the Democrat national headquarters. So this is an assault on our democracy, and this is, in essence, the main argument of the book. And as we approach what has all the makings of another contentious, very emotional presidential election, forearmed is forewarned. I mean, we have to prepare. I'd say the country is the frictions in the United States, if anything, have only been sharpened in the past 4 years, not blunted.
Yeah, thanks. And what about extremists on the left? I mean, they're not quite as, violent and concerning, but what are your thoughts there?
Well, I would say that they're violent and concerning. They're just less numerous, and we just haven't seen activity on the same par as we've seen from the far right. I mean, look, one of the most serious and what could have been the most consequential terrorist acts over the past 5 or 6 years occurred on the morning of in June 2017 in a congressional baseball practice for the annual congressional baseball game, where the Republican members of Congress were training. A self-professed supporter of Senator Bernie Sanders attempted to murder serving members of Congress from the Republican Party. I mean, tragedy was only averted because Steve Scalise from Louisiana, because he was, I can't remember if he was then majority or minority leader, but had a personal security detail from the U.S. Capitol Police, and they opened fire on this individual. Steve Scalise was, of course, very seriously wounded. It was a terrible tragedy that could have been far worse. And that's what worries me so much, is that we see violence on both ends of the spectrum. In some respect, the mass shootings that have been politically motivated over the past decade have exclusively come from violent far-right extremists. I mean, these are the ones that have racked up death tolls. Again, that 2017 congressional baseball practice could have joined that litany, but tragedy was averted. So we have to be prepared from violence from both sides. In fact, both extremes have become so extreme they've come together because they both embrace an accelerationist strategy where they believe the system in the United States is so corrupt and so rotted that only chaos and disorder calculated to bring it down and to lock the U.S. into this upward spiral of violence. Both sides, or both extremes, feeding off of one another is unfortunately what small numbers on both fringes actually embrace as a strategy. And law enforcement, of course, is caught in the middle.
Yeah, no, that is super interesting. And before we're starting to get some questions in, I want to encourage folks to continue to put their questions in the Q&A section. But I want to ask you, what can be done about extremism? And I guess in particular in the U.S., that's where, most of us are based here. What can we do about the rising tide of extremism? Are people, in your experience, are they rehabilitated, or how can we battle this?
Well, I think certain people can be rehabilitated. This is the whole premise behind countering violent extremism or countering radicalization. I mean, the problem that we've seen in terrorism for decades, maybe even forever, one could argue, because terrorism has existed for 2,000 years, basically as long as we're recording the history of mankind, is that there's not one universal solution. There's not one single silver-coated or plated answer that's going to resolve this. It has to be a holistic, and it has to be a sustained response. And that's the problem that I've discussed earlier, our kind of spasmodic interest in terrorism. In the aftermath of tragic attacks, we get spun up, we talk about legislation or countermeasures, but the consistency is what's important, because over time, what we've seen again and again is we tend to relax our vigilance, become more complacent, and that's exactly the window of opportunity. That's exactly the vulnerability or the opportunism that terrorists seize upon to strike again. So I would say consistency is the most important factor. I think in the United States, we could be strengthened by well-devised domestic terrorism legislation, because now there's a complete asymmetry in sentencing of people, depending whether they're what their religion is and what their race is, depending whether they're right or left. I mean, this was the subject of a recent New York Times article that in California, left-wing extremists were getting, far left extremists who engaged in violence were getting lesser sentence than those from the far right. So I think if we had a clear counterterrorism law, we could actually prosecute people for terrorism offenses. I mean, there is a terrorism enhancement statute that leaves that to individual judges. But what's the point of having this very subjective application of the law? We should have a more standardized one. Certainly reforming Section 230, I think, is another important dimension of that. In the longer term, that would perhaps engender a generational change, is enhancing digital and media literacy. In other words, teaching young people in high school, middle school, in elementary school, on a much more coordinated and comprehensive basis, how to determine what news is factual and what's emotional or opinion, how to actually determine if someone really is an expert and what it means to be an expert as opposed to a social influencer. I mean, these are the kinds of things that are done in pockets throughout the United States. In fact, very close to New York, the police chief of Elizabeth, New Jersey, as part of the Police Athletic League, has, in addition to training kids, well, teaching kids how to play basketball and baseball and taking them off the streets and giving them organized sports activity, because Chief Saka, Giacomo Saka, sees that it isn't being done in schools. He's doing it as part of the Police Athletic League. That's exactly what we need to encourage throughout the United States.
Got it. Interesting stuff. Let's start turning our attention to some of the questions that are coming in. One of which is, which terrorist group poses the greatest threat to the U.S., and is it the same one that's the most dangerous globally?
Tough question, because I think we have no shortage of enemies, from Salafi jihadi groups to groups like Hamas, for example, certainly groups Hezbollah. Certainly the Iranian threat network. There's been over 170 attacks on U.S. military personnel and facilities in the Middle East since October 7th by Iran's proxies. So unfortunately, there's no shortage of suspects. But to answer your question directly, I would default to General Kurilla and Director Abizaid's testimonies of recent months, where they have said ISIS, the Islamic State in particular, ISIS-K is probably foremost. But again, terrorists are the consummate opportunists. If they see the opportunity to strike, if they see that our attention is diverted onto another threat or another issue, they'll take advantage of that. So we know that Al-Qaeda, for example, has not given up its struggle from its propaganda, certainly which continues to focus on the United States. So I think we have to be vigilant against a range or a waterfront of threats. But nonetheless, the bottom line is, right now, one has to say, I mean, look, it's not easy to launch strikes in Russia and in Iran. And twice in the past 4 months, ISIS has succeeded in doing so. So that means that Europe in particular, but also the United States, could indeed be vulnerable as well.
Okay, another question here is, around the world, so-called waves of terrorism, according to some research and experts, there have been 4. Is it fair to suggest that we've entered a 5th wave, where the internet plays a massive role and where self-radicalized individuals, aka lone wolves, commit the majority of terrorist acts in the West and pose the highest risk, regardless of their ideological motivations?
Well, I agree, but with one caveat, and I'll depress the questioner even more, is I think we're in the 6th wave. The 5th wave, which even David Rappaport, the late professor from UCLA who sort of coined this model, he had already in recent years added a 5th wave, which was terrorism inspired and motivated by religion. I think he was late in doing so. I think, and I wrote about this in the late 1980s, I think religion was already forming a new wave in the 1980s, especially with the attacks on the U.S. diplomatic and military facilities in Lebanon, where we saw religion-inspiring terrorism elsewhere as well. But I think that's right. We are on a 6th wave with social media, or at least as these platforms are changing radicalization and recruitment to terrorism. And you're right. One of the main threats we face is from lone actors or lone wolves, because, of course, they're far more difficult to predict. There's no conspiracy that the authorities can identify and interdict. There's no communications within a terrorist group, orders being issued that might provide a flashing red light of an impending attack. But this is the problem or the challenge we face right now. It's not an either or, that it's lone wolves and we don't have to worry about the terrorist organizations. The fact of the matter is, just as we saw in Moscow a couple of weeks ago, we have to worry about both.
Absolutely. One of the attendees is asking if do you have any recommendations for people who live in cities that might have, say sleeper cells or might be particularly a target for terrorists? I have a couple thoughts, but I wonder what you would advise people on kind of, being vigilant about these threats.
Well, we're only as good as our last success. And clearly, the United States in particular, uh, law enforcement and intelligence have been very successful in preventing another 9/11 like attack. I think the danger, as the previous questioner speaks of, is from lone wolves. But one has to say there's also a huge danger, for instance, from quadcopters, from drones. I mean, as we saw on October 7th, they were such a powerful weapon. There, I think it's a little known fact that only federal government authorities have the power to shoot down drones. And federal government law enforcement officers, most of them are plainclothes, not uniform. They're not deployed on these kinds of duties. There are tens of thousands of more state, local, and tribal police officers that don't have that authority yet. And this is something I think we have to look into very seriously, because as we've seen, as my mentor and first boss at the Rand Corporation, Brian Jenkins, famously said 3 or 4 decades ago, terrorists are more imitative than they are innovative. I'll add that the few times when terrorists are innovative, they find lots of imitators. So this is a threat I think we have to calculate. And, look, law enforcement itself has been eroded in terms of its ability to recruit over the past 4 years. Attention has been diverted away incontrovertibly over the past 3 years from terrorism, because, of course, with our withdrawal from Afghanistan, for all intents and purposes, the war on terror was declared over. I think we look to exemplars like New York City Police Department's, pioneering counterterrorism role, which I think provides an example elsewhere. They have never relaxed their vigilance because they understand that for decades now, New York is always first and foremost the target of terrorists, as well as other big cities in the United States. But generally, there's always going to be these kinds of incidents in New York. And I think that vigilance has to be maintained in an era where we see terrorists are still active throughout the world. And when they're active throughout the world, it's not forever that the United States remains invulnerable.
Absolutely. Last opportunity for folks to get in their questions. I encourage you to do so. We'll try to squeeze them in. One attendee asked if there will be a recording of this event. There will be. We look forward to sharing that with you. Thanks for asking that. Bruce, I want to use my privilege here as the host to get back to a subject I care about, and I know you guys have, you and I have talked a little bit about, which is China and the situation in Western China. You and I have talked about how after 9/11, there was kind of a tacit bargain. Maybe it wasn't quite so tacit and, affected policy that the U.S. would kind of look the other way as the Chinese kind of did what they wanted to in Xinjiang if they supported the U.S. war on terror. And I think we've seen increased repression, no doubt, in Western China as a result, where there's actually a real genocide going on where they're trying to destroy the identity of a people. What are your concerns? How do you think about governments internationally battling extremism and terrorism, where one government's extremist might be another government's freedom fighter? How do you think about that as a researcher?
Well, firstly, I've been to Xinjiang and traveled around Urumqi, and I know I'm mispronouncing it, but the surrounding countryside. And there's definitely, even when I was there, it was evident that there was at least ethnic cleansing going on. That's for sure. The Han Chinese dominance was clearly palpable and visible. And now we have a situation where human rights organizations estimate that upwards of 1 million Uyghurs are in quote unquote against their will re-education camps. I don't think we should make those deals. I mean, I think it violates our principles. I think that it not only violates our fundamental principles of democracy and freedom and equality, but it also empowers countries to use the fear of terrorism as a way to repress their peoples, sometimes when it's not entirely genuine. And it also has ensured that I think there's less attention because of this that's focused on the plight of the Uyghurs. I mean, one only has to talk to many Uyghurs that have found refuge in the United States to understand what's unfolding to their relations, their friends, people in their neighborhood. And, these kinds of things are to be decried, not supported.
Absolutely. We're getting towards the finish line, but someone is asking a little bit about how I hadn't heard this, but Vladimir Putin had designated LGBTQ groups as extremist groups. Is that something that you've heard a little bit about? And why don't you just share a thought on that? And then as we're getting towards the finish line, I also would love to invite you to, share some predictions about, the election, the next year in terrorism. Put on your, break out your crystal ball, if you will.
Well, interestingly, President Putin bans or demonizes anything he doesn't like or agree with. And I can't see how LGBTQ rights in any sense can be labeled terrorism. I mean, there's no violence in it. You're talking about people that are persecuted just because of their sexual orientation or preferences. And actually, when Putin doesn't like something, he tries to bury it. And this is something that he's trying to erase as well. I mean, much like we were just discussing with China. I have to say, too, that 24 years ago, Putin banned my book, Inside Terrorism, in the Duma for the same reason, because he said that a book that argues against terrorism actually facilitates terrorism, because he didn't agree with the conclusions, because I was talking about the importance of the liberal democratic state applying the rule of law against terrorism. So he disagreed with that. So no, I mean, that's not terrorism, but that's one of the, unfortunately, truths that we see, is that throughout history, or certainly recent history, anything that governments or leaders don't like, they label terrorism. I mean, the one thing we can agree on, and there's so much disagreement, what's terrorism, what isn't terrorism. The one thing we can agree on is it's a negative term, and no one wants to be labeled a terrorist, and that it's used often for political purpose. In terms of my crystal ball, we're in a very dangerous time in multiple places throughout the world, where there's wars going on, where democracy is threatened, where excuses are made for sometimes the worst kind of terrorism offenses by groups that are completely totalitarian and authoritarian. And unfortunately, what's happening, I think, is that in many instances, as I said earlier, the perpetrators of this violence are convinced that terrorism works. So that's not going to act as a brake. That's not going to decrease their proclivity or their intentions to use violence. Now, there's often, fortunately, a gulf between intentions and capability. But in this environment, terrorist groups, and we talked about quadcopters, things that you can buy on the internet for less than $1,000 that can be equipped to drop explosives, or just for surveillance purposes as well. I mean, technology is becoming more friendly to terrorists, so we have to also think of how terrorists are going to harness technology. But also, on the same side, we have, as governments, tremendous abilities, but we'll only be successful against terrorists, and we'll only be able to harness those tremendous abilities to counter terrorism if we maintain our vigilance, and if we understand that this is an ongoing threat, that it's not, as I said earlier, as episodic or spasmodic or isolated as we tend to see it. And I mean, this is something that's at least reputed to that Thomas Jefferson said, that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, and that's absolutely right.
I like that we are ending with Thomas Jefferson. Very timely. Bruce and Jeremy, I'd like to thank you both very much once again. For those that didn't catch it, we dropped the link for Bruce's latest book into the chat. We strongly recommend and urge you to pick it up. The same with Jeremy's upcoming book that's going to be released this summer. And look forward to the next session. I think it's next month, and we're gonna change course and cover different topics that are timely and pertinent to all as well. So once again, thank you very much. We'll be circulating the link to this session, which will have not just notes, but also the audio and video. Once again, everyone, thank you very much for your time.